All right, so I'm the Extension Irrigation Specialist, USU, and a lot of what I'm going to be talking about, Dan gave a really good introduction to. I'm going to be talking about using sensors and especially uh, soil water sensors for irrigation scheduling. What I'm not going to do is recommend specific products. I'll give some ideas of types of sensors and what they're measuring, and then go over again some of the principles that Dan talked about. One thing to remember, and again, just kind of feeding off of what Dan had talked about, the goal of irrigation. Now, there can be a lot of goals of irrigation if you get all technical about it, but for most of us, the goal of irrigation is to maintain water content in the soil in a favorable range for crop production. We don't want too much and we don't want too little. And so whenever we're looking at irrigation scheduling, we're looking at the different things. We have certain constraints. We have the crop's sensitivity to water stress. We have the crop's root depth. We have our soils and their ability to hold water. And we may have the frequency in which water is available to us to irrigate. If you're on an irrigation company and you have a fixed turn, you may only be able to get water to your crop every couple of weeks. So with a lot of our smaller farms and certainly our urban areas, that's not so much an issue. But anybody that's got water shares to a water company may have some of those limitations. One thing to remember is that any crop production is related to the amount of water that the crop receives. And so it's common to get a curve that looks something like this. If we look at yield on the one axis and the amount of water that's provided to the crop on the other, we need a certain amount of water to get any yield. And then the yield increases as we apply more water. And then we reach a point where the crop really stops responding to additional water added. And then if we add enough water to waterlog a crop, it'll decrease. Alfalfa is a good example of a crop where we overwater alfalfa and we lose production. Our vegetable crops are interesting, like Dan had mentioned, because there's a lot of quality issues, and this kind of relationship I'm showing here doesn't take into account the quality issues in a crop. And even our grain crops have those quality issues. We may be getting a yield under less water, but we can have significant quality problems when we under irrigate. And part of that is that when a plant is stressed, and I'm talking about a grain crop, not a vegetable crop, but when a plant is stressed, it is more susceptible to disease. It's less competitive against weeds. And so we get this pest pressure that we start to lose quality sometimes just from that. So how do we keep it in that range? And that's kind of where we're looking. So Dan had talked about, we have kind of this bank account in the soil where we're holding water. If we look at where the water comes from and where it goes, we have what we call the soil root zone, this area that looks like red sandpaper instead of brown sandpaper. And that's where we're really managing water. So we get a certain amount of precipitation. Some of our precipitation is going to usually run off a field. especially here in the northern part of the state. In the early part of the year, we get rain events that are large enough to generate runoff. In the southern part of the state, late in the summer, if we get monsoonal rains, we get enough rain to generate runoff. And so not all the precipitation we receive infiltrates into the soil and directly benefits the plant. There are things we can do to help with that, help reduce runoff, but that's just something to be aware of. Of course, we have our irrigation, and hopefully we're managing our irrigation so that it does not have runoff. And then if we over irrigate, a certain amount of the water we apply will drain below the root zone. The soil just can't hold it. We may do that on purpose. Grant talked a lot about leaching, intentionally irrigating enough to drive a certain amount of water below the root zones, an important part of salt management. If we have salty irrigation sources, then we often have to intentionally over irrigate, if you will. I kind of do the quotation thing because I wouldn't consider it over irrigating if you're intentionally applying enough water for leaching. But we may intentionally have deep drainage because of that. And then we have our evapotranspiration. The trick with evapotranspiration, or ET, is we really can't measure it. Every way we have to kind of measure it is indirect, and the best ways cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to put a volume of soil and plants in a large container called a lysimeter that can weigh changes in the soil water content. It just measures the weight of that whole system, the soil and the plants, and from those differences we get evapotranspiration. Those systems, like I said, they cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to install, and it's a full-time job to maintain them. That's very high-end research kind of equipment. There's maybe about 3 decent sites in the United States that do that kind of research. So, and then there's some internationally, but that we're talking about really intensive stuff. Everything else we do is even more indirect. And so a lot of times we use models. And when Dan was talking about reference ET and crop coefficients, that's a model. And it can be a very effective model, but that's what we're dealing with. And so that's why we talk about, well, what are the crop coefficients and what would we recommend, and those kinds of things. You're trying to get a model that's appropriate for your production. So let's take a look at the soil then. We've got a pretty good introduction and some background on how we can use those ET models. Spoiler alert, I'll just say that I like combined methods where we use soil measurements and the ET models, and kind of have two estimates. So let's look at the soil. If we dive into the soil and pretend that it has perfectly uniform little spheres of soil particles, we get something like this. We have the solid soil particles, and then we have this void space, we call it. If it was all the way dry, it'd be filled with air in the soil. So we can take it and we can add water. And if we fill that all the way up with water, then we end up with a saturated situation like the one on the right. But that won't last long. Gravity will pull that water out until it's more something like this. After 1 to 3 days, it really depends on the soil. Grant had talked about the ability of water to move and get distributed through the soil. A major driver of that is gravity. Well, eventually, water is being held between soil particles uh, due to capillary action. You may recall when maybe you were in like a high school class or something, or maybe it came up in a college class or something, capillary tubes where you can put basically a small straw in water, and the surface tension of the water itself will draw itself up into the tube. And if you have a really narrow tube, it'll draw higher into the tube than if you have a wider tube. Those same forces are what's holding water in soil. We have these little spaces between soil particles, and the surface tension of the water holds it to these soil particles. And eventually it kind of holds the water against gravity. And so you have a certain amount of water in the soil after it's drained. And that's field capacity. Dan talked about field capacity. So that's kind of how much water the soil will hold against gravity. Now we might start drying the soil out more using other means like plant roots extracting water or evaporation. And eventually we can dry a soil out so much that a plant root can no longer extract water. So I guess if Grant called that when salt contributes to that, he called that I think he called it a chemical drought or something like that. Physically, eventually that'll happen with your soil anyway. As it gets dry enough, the force that the water is held to the soil particles is so strong, the plant can no longer extract the water from the soil, and the plant will die. And so that we call permanent wilting point. We've reached a point when you can no longer sustain plant growth. And then there's a range of soil water contents in between, and each of them, the water is held in the soil with a kind of a different level of force. And there's a kind of a point on the wet end where there's kind of a range when the plant doesn't really have too much trouble getting water from the soil. And it reaches a point where now the plant's having to work a little harder. When a plant extracts water from the soil, it sits there and it loads solutes into the root, different compounds or ions into the root to force water through osmosis to draw into the root. So it takes energy for the plant to do that. And so as the soil starts to dry out, the plant has to add more and more solutes into the root, and eventually that starts decreasing plant growth. And that's why we see it kind of just start to drop off, less and less water, less and less production, and eventually the plant dies. Again, not accounting for the effects of water or of crop quality in that, which could happen early on with water stress. So we can look at this and look at our soil reservoir as kind of being a bucket. We saw kind of a scale earlier. This is the same idea. We have a bucket where if it's all the way full, it's at saturation. And maybe we have a kind of a little tap where we can fill it up, but eventually it's going to drop down to filled capacity on its own. And then we have a range of water that's available to the plant. Permanent wilting point is not bone dry soil. It'll still look a little damp. If it's dry, it's notably drier than even permanent wilting point, just for reference. So we get something like this is what I just mentioned. The crop production is good for a while, and then as we get drier and drier, eventually we're dead. And we can reach a point on this scale where even if we go dry and then we irrigate back up, we've had yield loss or quality loss that we can't regain. Okay, So now from a managing irrigation standpoint, and this is another graph like some of the ones that Dan showed. So we've got this, our bucket that we call available water capacity, or total available water. If we kind of take that and turn it into inches or millimeters, by multiplying by our root depth. Here's an example. This is some real work I did. This is in corn, and you can see the green line is kind of our total available water. It's field capacity multiplied, or it's our available water capacity really, but multiplied by the root depth. And so we've kind of estimated the root growth for the first couple months in a corn crop. And in this case, we've tried to manage water. This is in Nebraska, this particular graph, if you're wondering why it seems so wet, if you're looking at it. But we try to leave enough room for some rainfall. It depends on your soils and if we're in a time of year when you expect rainfall. So I add that rain allowance in there as kind of a threshold. And then we have this management allowed depletion. That's the value we really don't want to go drier than. And notice in a maturing corn crop, that might be way drier than we would ever let a vegetable crop go to, for example. So it really is crop dependent. If you don't know any better, if you're growing something like pasture or grains or grasses, 50% is a pretty good estimate. If you're talking about something like a vegetable crop, Dan already mentioned that 30%, maybe 40% range, we don't go as dry. So then the blue line would be the soil water content. This one's kind of averaged over the full root zone, and this particular line is based on measurements that we took. So we kind of watch it, and there's a couple strategies we could do. We can say, well, I'm not going to irrigate unless that blue line drops to the red line. Okay. And sometimes there's software, if you get sensors, the company that provides them will generate a graph like this, which is really nice. We have a tool that I put in the question and answer, Irrigation Scheduler Mobile. It was developed by colleagues up in Washington State. And they have included now the weather station networks in Utah and a lot of our crops. And so you can get on there and kind of simulate this kind of root balance using ET models, like what Dan was saying. And you can actually go in, if you had measurements, you can correct the model using soil moisture measurements. Sorry, just checking my time real quick. So if we look at this, we can irrigate. We basically want to keep it between the red and the green line. If we feel like we're in a time of year when we're going to get some precipitation, we might kind of give some allowance for that. And that's what we're trying to do. And that's what we would do with sensors. So here's some sensors. These are some common types. The green one on the left is a watermark sensor. It's a granular matrix potential sensor, is I guess kind of the technical description. Watermark is the kind of the model of the sensor. This particular sensor actually measures the force, or responds to the force of water, how it's held in the soil, or what we call tension or matrix potential, referring to the soil matrix. Otherwise, we can measure water content in terms of volumetric water content, or the portion of the soil that is water. And so that goes back to the idea of field capacity and wilting point. A certain portion of the water, soil volume is water. And so maybe Field capacity might be 40% if in a soil with a really high field capacity, might be 40%, maybe more like 30% of the soil volume is water. Wilting point might be more in the 10 to 20% range. So we put in a sensor. The one with the big yellow cable is a time domain reflectometry sensor, a TDR. That's kind of for electric sensors, the gold standard for volumetric water content. There's a lot of others. Most are capacitance based. So they're measuring the capacitance of the soil and relating that back to soil water content. You have to be careful with capacitance based probes because some are very good and applicable to a lot of soils and some are not. And that's why I show the TDR kind. It's a little more expensive, but in general, a true TDR sensor will be more accurate than a capacitance. That's not to say there aren't capacitance probes that have a really good accuracy. Now, a trick with any of these is the measurement volume. None of these sensors are measuring a very large area. So where you place the sensor is really important. You want to represent the bed or the crop. Typically, we don't want it right under a drip line. We want it somewhere where we're representing the average condition. So if we have kind of if we're growing under plastic, say, I would put it halfway between the drip line and the edge of the plastic. And normally we put multiple depths, which I apologize, we're not going to get to really in this discussion, but I wanted to touch on soil tension. Because if you use this kind of sensor, like the watermark sensor here, you're going to get a tension reading. It's going to be in terms of centibars, which doesn't really matter. You just need to know what centerbar reading is helpful for you. Just like you would need to know what your wilting point or available water capacity were. So here's just an example for a loam soil. The red lines tell you where filled capacity, that's the one on the left, and wilting point are. And you can see what they might be in terms of soil water tension or what they might be in volumetric water content. With soil water tension, Dan showed a good graph about this with the different watermark sensors and kind of just said, you're going to want to have kind of a threshold to irrigate at. So maybe 60 centibars or something. I gave you the spoiler alert already that I like to use a combined approach where we use maybe a weather station and the sensors. And so we go back to this graph where we have the ET, we look at changes in water content, and maybe we get something like this where the model is doing the blue line and the measurements are these black dots. And so we could, using something like Irrigation Scheduler Mobile, we can correct and it'll let us look into the future and kind of make some estimates. The one last thing I wanted to talk about was measuring weather data and precipitation. There's a lot of weather stations you could buy to put on your farm or property, and I'm going to caution against that from the standpoint of irrigation management. You might need those for frost protection or things like that, but I strongly caution against putting out weather stations for modeling ET on your own farm. Reference ET doesn't change that much over large distances. It would be much better to use a well-maintained and scientific grade weather network like the Utah Climate Center maintains. With the exception of precipitation. I would measure precipitation at the field level, but I would use a manual read rain gauge. It's much easier to make sure that it's giving you an accurate reading. My website is irrigation.usu.edu, and I didn't leave a ton of time for questions, which I apologize